On the surface, they were the kind of couple that people admired. David Miller, 42, was known around town as a hard-working and dependable man. He had built a career in finance, earning a stable income that allowed him and his wife to live comfortably in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Friends described him as the type of man who'd give you the shirt off his back. He was polite, patient, and generous, the kind of husband many envied and many wives wished they had. His wife, Laura, was 38, a striking woman who seemed to effortlessly command attention. Where David was quiet and grounded, Laura was charming and outgoing. She loved hosting dinner parties, attending social events, and living a life that sparkled with attention. Neighbors often commented that Laura always appeared put together. Her hair perfectly styled, her clothes expensive, her smile never fading. To outsiders, they seemed to have it all. A comfortable home in a desirable neighborhood. 2 cars parked neatly in the driveway. Vacations that filled their social media with sun-drenched beaches and candlelit dinners. A love story that appeared seamless, unmarred by the struggles that most marriages endure. But behind the polished photos and friendly waves at neighbors, their marriage was beginning to show cracks. Cracks no one could see, yet ones that would soon split wide open. David was practical with money. He worried about bills, college funds for their teenage daughter, and retirement savings. Laura, however, had different priorities. She adored shopping trips, spa days, and the finer things in life. Credit card statements often revealed more than David wanted to admit. Arguments about spending became frequent. Still, whenever tensions flared, they smoothed it over with smiles for the outside world. To their friends and family, they were still the perfect couple. No one could imagine the darkness growing beneath that facade. A darkness that would eventually end in betrayal, greed, and murder. In the fall of 2018, David made what he thought was a responsible decision. After seeing a coworker suddenly pass away and leave his family scrambling financially, David decided it was time to take steps to protect his own. He scheduled an appointment with his insurance agent and signed a $500,000 life insurance policy. To David, it was an act of love. An invisible shield meant to safeguard Laura and their teenage daughter if anything ever happened to him. David never hesitated when asked to name the beneficiary. Without question, he wrote down his wife's name, Laura Miller. To David, it was simple. If tragedy struck, Laura would be financially secure. The mortgage would be paid. Their daughter could go to college without debt. Laura could live comfortably, free of financial stress. But to Laura, the policy looked very different. $500,000, written out in black and white, wasn't just security. To her, it was freedom. It was luxury. It was an escape from the arguments about money, from the restraint David tried to place on her spending, from the life she felt was smaller than she deserved. Laura signed the papers with a smile that David mistook for gratitude. But in that moment, a dangerous thought began to grow in her mind. What if I didn't have to wait for this money? She didn't voice it, of course. To everyone else, Laura was still the doting wife, supportive and loyal. But the seed had been planted. And seeds like that don't just fade. They grow, twisting into something darker with each passing day. The policy meant protection for David. But for Laura, it became something else entirely. It became a motive. By early 2019, the cracks in David and Laura's marriage were widening. On paper, they looked financially stable. David's steady job in finance paid the bills. But the reality was much tighter than most people realized. Between the mortgage, car payments, and their daughter's future tuition, money was stretched thin. David was careful, even frugal. He checked credit card statements every month, keeping a close eye on expenses. But no matter how much he tried to rein things in, the numbers never added up. The culprit was clear, Laura. Her taste for the finer things was insatiable. Designer handbags, high-end spa treatments, expensive dinners with friends, Laura spent as though the couple had endless wealth. She loved the admiration that came with it. In her mind, appearances mattered more than practicality. Whenever David confronted her, Laura brushed him off with a smile. Don't worry so much. You work hard. We deserve to enjoy life. But David worried. He knew that if something didn't change, their so-called perfect life could crumble. What David didn't know, however, was that Laura's spending habits weren't just about luxury. They were about escape. She had quietly rekindled an old flame with a man from her past, a relationship David knew nothing about. The secret lover was everything David wasn't. Reckless, fun, indulgent. He encouraged Laura's lavish lifestyle, made her feel alive again. But he also came with expectations. Expectations Laura couldn't fulfill without money. That's when Laura began to see the life insurance policy not as security, but as opportunity. $500,000 could buy her freedom. It could erase debt, fund her extravagant life, and keep her lover close. What began as financial frustration quickly morphed into something far more sinister. Laura didn't just want money. She wanted David out of the way, and soon she would begin to plan exactly how to make that happen. Laura's plan didn't form overnight. First, it was just a fleeting thought. What if David weren't here anymore? But as the weeks passed, that thought began to take shape. Divorce crossed her mind, but it wasn't what she wanted. Divorce meant splitting assets, explaining her affair, and walking away with far less than she craved. The life insurance policy was her golden ticket, and she wasn't about to give it up. Laura began doing research, quietly, carefully, always on her personal laptop when David wasn't home. Late at night, she typed questions into search engines. What household substances can kill without being detected? Slow-acting poison symptoms. Best way to disguise bitter taste in food. Her searches led her down a dark rabbit hole. She read about arsenic, antifreeze, and even certain prescription medications that, if administered over time, could slowly wear down the body without raising suspicion. By spring, she had made her choice. Something tasteless, something easy to slip into food or drink. Something that would make David appear sick, not poisoned. The kitchen became her weapon. Laura started with tiny doses, mixing the substance into his coffee, soups, or evening glass of wine. At first, David didn't notice anything unusual. He chalked up his queasy stomach to stress from work or a lingering flu bug. But soon, the symptoms grew harder to ignore. David began to feel constant fatigue, waves of nausea, and sharp stomach pains. He brushed it off, telling coworkers he must have caught a stomach virus. Meanwhile, Laura played the role of the doting wife. She made him tea, cooked his meals, reminded him to rest. To anyone watching, she was the picture of devotion, caring, attentive, worried. But behind her gentle smile was calculation. Each spoonful, each sip, was another step toward her ultimate goal, a $500,000 payday. Laura had found her method, and now it was only a matter of time. At first, David dismissed his symptoms. He told himself it was probably stress, maybe a bug he couldn't shake off. But as the weeks dragged on, it became harder to ignore. The once energetic man who prided himself on early morning jogs and long workdays was now exhausted after climbing a single flight of stairs. He grew pale, gaunt, and struggled to keep food down. Coworkers whispered in concern. Friends who hadn't seen him in a while were startled by his appearance. Doctors ran routine tests but found nothing alarming. They chalked it up to a gastrointestinal issue or perhaps a virus that just needed time to pass. They prescribed rest, fluids, and light medication, never once suspecting that something far more sinister was happening behind the closed doors of his home. Through it all, Laura played her part flawlessly. She told everyone she was worried sick about David, that she barely slept, that she spent her days nursing him back to health. To the outside world, she was a devoted wife sacrificing everything to care for her husband. But behind her nurturing facade, she was methodical. Every day, she carefully prepared his meals, making sure each contained just enough poison to keep him weak, but not enough to kill him instantly. She wanted his decline to look natural, an illness no doctor could trace. David's trust in his wife never wavered. On his weakest days, he thanked her for taking care of him. He leaned on her for support, never once imagining that the very hands spooning soup to his lips were the same ones slowly orchestrating his death. Family members began to notice how unwell David looked. His sister asked him bluntly one evening, Are you sure Laura isn't overfeeding you with vitamins or something strange? David laughed it off, defending his wife. He believed in her completely. But as his health spiraled, Laura's confidence grew. Her plan was working. The poison was doing its job. And soon, she would decide it was time to deliver the final fatal dose. By midsummer, David's decline was unmistakable. He had lost nearly 30 pounds. His skin hung loose against his bones, and dark circles carved deep beneath his eyes. Walking across the room left him winded. Family begged him to seek further medical help, but David resisted. The doctors had found nothing serious, and he didn't want to burden anyone with more medical bills. Besides, he told himself, Laura's taking such good care of me. I'll get better soon. But Laura had no intention of letting him get better. After months of carefully measured doses, she decided the time had come. She had played the role of caretaker long enough. The policy was waiting, and her patience was wearing thin. On a warm July evening, Laura prepared dinner with meticulous care. She poured David a glass of wine, as she often did, and stirred a final, lethal dose into his food. The substance dissolved without a trace. Odorless, tasteless, undetectable. David sat at the table, weak but trying to smile. He thanked Laura for cooking, unaware that his gratitude was sealing his fate. Hours later, the symptoms hit harder than ever before. Violent stomach cramps, sweating, and dizziness sent David collapsing onto the floor. Laura dialed 911, her voice frantic, rehearsed. Please hurry. My husband, he's not breathing. Paramedics rushed to the house, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. David Miller, just 42 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. Doctors listed the cause as a sudden cardiac arrest, brought on by his recent mysterious illness. To most, it looked like a tragic but natural end to months of unexplained sickness. Laura wept at the hospital, her performance flawless. She hugged relatives, thanked friends for their support, and clung to her role as the grieving widow. No one suspected the truth. What nobody knew that night was that David's death wasn't sudden, and it wasn't natural. It was calculated, cold-blooded, murder. And Laura now stood on the brink of collecting the reward for her crime, a $500,000 life insurance payout. Just days after David's funeral, Laura was already moving forward with startling efficiency. While his family was still reeling from shock, she was making phone calls to the insurance company, to banks, to her lawyer. With David gone, the $500,000 life insurance policy was now hers for the taking. She signed the paperwork with trembling hands, but not from grief. It was excitement. Within weeks, the check arrived. $500,000. More money than Laura had ever seen in her life was suddenly hers, and she wasted no time spending it. Laura bought herself a brand new luxury SUV, a sparkling diamond bracelet, and designer clothes that filled her walk-in closet. Neighbors who dropped by with condolences couldn't help but notice the sudden upgrades. Instead of retreating in sorrow, Laura seemed to be thriving. She booked a tropical vacation to clear her head, posting smiling photos on social media, cocktails in hand, sunsets in the background, not a trace of mourning on her face. Her daughter's friends whispered at school that Laura looked too happy for someone who had just lost her husband. David's sister privately told relatives that something felt off. The whispers grew louder when rumors surfaced of Laura being spotted with another man, the same man she had been secretly seeing before David's death. Dinner dates, shopping trips, nights out, all paid for with David's insurance money. To outsiders, it seemed tasteless, even disrespectful. But to investigators, who were quietly beginning to watch Laura's behavior, it was more than that. It was suspicious. Because while sudden deaths sometimes happen, the combination of an unexplained illness, a massive life insurance payout, and a widow who spent lavishly instead of grieving, was enough to raise red flags. And soon, the whispers of suspicion would become something far louder, an investigation. At first, David's death was written off as a tragedy. A man in his early 40s, apparently struck down by sudden illness. But as the weeks passed, the story didn't sit right with everyone. David's family, especially his sister, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She remembered the last conversation she had with him, how he had mentioned a bitter taste in his coffee some mornings, how he often felt nauseous after meals at home. At the time, she dismissed it. But now, with Laura living lavishly off his life insurance, those memories gnawed at her. "I just don't believe it," she told relatives. "He was sick, yes, but not that sick. And now she's spending his money like he was never here." Friends who had seen David in the months before his death also came forward, recalling his sudden and unexplained decline. Some began quietly contacting authorities, voicing their concerns. Police took notice. What stood out most was the life insurance policy. A healthy man dies mysteriously, and his wife cashes in $500,000 weeks later. It was a textbook red flag for insurance-motivated homicide. Investigators began digging. They pulled Laura's financial records, which revealed massive debts paid off almost immediately after David's death. They checked her phone, finding frequent calls and texts to another man, her secret lover, both before and after her husband's passing. Neighbors also reported unusual things. One recalled how Laura rarely seemed worried during David's illness, even when he was bedridden. Another remembered seeing her laughing on the phone the very night after David died. The pieces weren't adding up. To detectives, Laura's role as the grieving widow now looked more like a calculated performance. But suspicions alone weren't enough. To prove murder, they needed hard evidence, something that could point directly to foul play. That evidence would come in the form of a toxicology report. And once it was in, Laura's carefully constructed web of lies would begin to unravel. By the fall of 2019, the investigation had gained momentum. The combination of David's sudden death, Laura's suspicious spending, and witness statements had pushed authorities to take a decisive step: the exhumation of David's body. What had once been ruled a natural death would now be subjected to meticulous forensic scrutiny. The body was transported to the state laboratory, where toxicologists began testing for every possible substance, prescription drugs, common poisons, and rare chemicals alike. The process was painstaking and methodical. Weeks passed before the results came back. And when they did, the findings were shocking. The toxicology report revealed significant levels of poison in David's system, substances that could only have come from repeated ingestion over time. The slow-acting nature of the chemical explained why doctors had found nothing suspicious while David was alive. It was a textbook case of deliberate poisoning. For investigators, the case became clear. David had not died of natural causes. He had been murdered. Attention immediately turned to the person who had the most access: Laura Miller. Detectives began piecing together her digital footprint. Searches for lethal poisons, instructions on disguising taste, and dosage calculations all pointed to premeditation. Financial records confirmed she had benefited directly from the life insurance payout. And witnesses recalled her unusually calm demeanor during David's decline and after his death. It wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. Forensic science had confirmed what many had feared. The loving wife had turned deadly. Laura's carefully curated image of devotion and grief was crumbling. Her every move, once unnoticed, was now under the microscope of law enforcement. The question wasn't whether she had committed the crime. It was when she would be brought to justice. Laura Miller had built a flawless facade of the grieving widow. She had smiled for the cameras at the funeral, comforted relatives, and shared tearful memories of her late husband. But now, under the cold, unblinking eyes of investigators, cracks began to appear. Detectives called Laura in for questioning. At first, she was composed, rehearsed, and calm. She repeated the story she had told friends and family, that David had been sick for months, that she had cared for him tirelessly, and that his death had been sudden and tragic. But as the officers pressed for details, inconsistencies emerged. Her timeline of David's last days didn't match phone records or witness statements. She claimed she had no knowledge of any unusual online searches. Yet her laptop revealed a history filled with queries about poison, dosage, and how to conceal it in food. She insisted she had no other relationships, yet texts to her secret lover, written while David was alive, painted a different picture entirely. Detectives noticed small things, too. Laura's demeanor had changed when discussing financial matters. She seemed almost detached from David's death when asked about the insurance payout, her answers hesitant and evasive. Neighbors were interviewed again. One recalled seeing her laughing quietly during what should have been a mourning period. Another remembered her bringing home a man who was not David, raising eyebrows about the nature of her private life. The investigators' pressure mounted. Each question, each piece of evidence, began to chip away at the persona she had so carefully constructed. It became clear Laura Miller's grief was a performance. Behind the tear-streaked face and comforting words lay cold calculation and premeditated intent. The police had the evidence they needed: digital proof, financial motive, and forensic confirmation of poison. Laura was no longer untouchable. Soon, the handcuffs would close around her, and the story of the perfect widow would take a dramatic turn. The day of Laura Miller's arrest was quiet in the neighborhood, almost ordinary. Birds chirped, neighbors went about their routines, and the suburban streets seemed calm. But inside one modest home, police officers were preparing to confront a woman whose carefully constructed life was about to collapse. Detectives arrived at Laura's house mid-morning. They knocked on the door, identifying themselves and requesting that she come with them for questioning. Laura, ever composed, initially smiled and asked what this was about. But when the officers presented the arrest warrant, citing first-degree murder and insurance fraud, the smile faltered. You can't do this," she stammered. Her voice, usually confident, wavered for the first time. She was handcuffed and led to the squad car while a small crowd of neighbors gathered, whispering among themselves. Some were shocked. Others had long suspected that the widow's story didn't add up. As she was placed in the car, Laura's thoughts must have raced. The $500,000 she had so meticulously planned to collect was now at risk. The image of freedom, luxury, and secret love that had driven her actions now seemed like a cruel illusion. Media soon descended on the quiet suburb. News crews broadcast the arrest, and the story of the perfect wife turned murderer spread rapidly. Her friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the woman they knew, the charming, sophisticated, devoted wife, with the one police claimed had poisoned her husband for money. Inside the police station, Laura was formally booked. Fingerprints taken, photographs snapped, statements recorded, every detail documented, forming a paper trail that would later be crucial in court. For the first time, Laura Miller was not in control. Her lies, manipulations, and careful performance had unraveled. The charming widow was now a suspect facing life-changing consequences. The next step was inevitable: trial. And the courtroom would reveal just how far greed and betrayal could push someone to destroy the life of the person they once promised to love. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space, cameras clicked, and the gallery was filled with curious onlookers, neighbors, and family members. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had been painted as a devoted wife now accused of murdering her husband for life insurance money. Laura Miller sat at the defendant's table, poised but tense. Her lawyer whispered last-minute instructions, while prosecutors prepared to lay out a case that would shock the nation. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated greed. A woman who had meticulously planned her husband's slow poisoning, maintained an affair, and quickly moved to claim a $500,000 life insurance policy. They described digital evidence, search history detailing poisons and methods of administration, text messages with her lover, and financial records showing sudden purchases after David's death. The defense attempted to argue that David's death was natural. They claimed that Laura had no motive, that she loved her husband, and that her searches for poison were innocent curiosity or coincidental. But each witness and piece of evidence steadily eroded their narrative. Friends testified about Laura's unusually fast return to social life, her lavish spending, and her seeming detachment during David's decline. Neighbors recounted odd behaviors and visits from a mysterious man before and after the death. Forensic experts presented the toxicology report, confirming the presence of poison in David's system, enough to kill, administered over time. The prosecution was methodical. They walked the jury through each stage of Laura's deception. The slow-acting poison in everyday meals, her consistent performance as a caring wife, the calculated cashing in of the life insurance policy, efforts to cover her digital trail, which ultimately failed. The defense tried to sow doubt, suggesting that perhaps David's death was caused by an undiagnosed medical condition. But the evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just circumstantial. It was scientific, digital, and financial, a trifecta pointing directly at Laura. Witness after witness took the stand, and the story of betrayal, greed, and manipulation unfolded like a dark drama. Every detail revealed the extent of Laura's premeditation. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the jury was left with a clear choice. They had seen the pattern. A once trusted spouse turned predator, a loving facade masking lethal intent. Outside the courtroom, the public followed the proceedings avidly. The case was quickly dubbed the life insurance murder, a cautionary tale of trust, betrayal, and the deadly power of greed. The courtroom was tense. Every eye was fixed on the jury as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision that would determine Laura Miller's fate. The judge's voice was calm but firm. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, hands shaking slightly. The foreperson cleared their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Laura Miller, guilty of first-degree murder and insurance fraud." A hush fell over the courtroom. Laura's face paled. The calm, composed widow who had once controlled every aspect of her life now appeared fragile, cornered, and exposed. Gasps rippled through the gallery. David's family wept quietly, relief and grief mingling in a complex emotional storm. Friends who had suspected her smiled grimly, knowing justice had been served. Reporters quickly documented every moment, broadcasting the verdict across the nation. Laura was immediately taken into custody, her bail revoked. Her lawyer attempted to appeal, citing procedural issues, but the evidence had been overwhelming. Poison in David's system, digital records of premeditation, financial gain, and witness testimony. The sentencing hearing followed soon after. The judge condemned Laura's actions as cold, calculated, and morally reprehensible. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, the press captured the reactions of David's family. His sister spoke with a voice heavy with emotion. David trusted the person he loved most. That trust was betrayed in the worst way imaginable. But we finally have justice for him. For Laura, life behind bars replaced the freedom, wealth, and secret indulgences she had once imagined. The $500,000 she had so carefully schemed to claim had come at a cost far greater than any reward. The verdict served as a stark reminder. Appearances can deceive, and even the closest relationships can hide deadly intentions.